Scientists realize that the Moon, which has been orbiting the Earth for billions of years, is suddenly changing its orbit. A former astronaut in Jocinda Fowler proposes a means of escape, but it is so fantastic that few believe in its realization, except her former fellow astronaut and scientist. 2011, during a mission to repair a satellite in Earth orbit, astronauts Joe Fowler, Brian Harper, and Alan Marcus are attacked by an unknown entity that looks like a swarm of black particles. Alan dies, and Brian manages to reach the shuttle where the unconscious Joe is and lands the shuttle on the ground. During the investigation, Brian tells about a black swarm that went towards the Sea of Crisis on the Moon, but his explanation does not satisfy the commission. Joe is unable to corroborate his colleague's testimony. Despite the brilliant landing of the shuttle in manual mode, Brian is accused of negligence that led to the death of his partner, and is fired from NASA. The man loses his home, his family is forced to move to another city, which is very upsetting for his son. Passes 10 years, part-time janitor at the observatory Casey Houseman, who believes in the theory of artificial origin of the Moon. He fraudulently obtains data from the Chilean telescope, and after reading it, he is one of the first to realize that something bad is happening in space. He tries to get through to NASA management, but they just laugh at him. Joe Fowler has become deputy director of NASA. She is awakened by disturbing news from the Space Center, where she heads in the early morning hours. Observers provide her with evidence of the Moon shifting out of its usual orbit, with instruments picking up a strange eruption near Sea of Crisis. Meanwhile, Casey accidentally finds an ad for a lecture to be given by former astronaut Brian Harper and rushes to the venue. But inside he sees only children, who are also waiting for the lecture to begin. Brian himself wakes up at this time from the banging on the door of the angry owner and, jumping out the window, rushes to the observatory, where KC is already proving to the children that the Moon is hollow and made by an unknown civilization. Because when Apollo 12 dropped the tank, the Moon rang like a bell. Brian listens to KC's message about the Moon falling and asks security to take out the crazy man who is scaring the kids. In the evening, Brian gets a call from his ex-wife Brenda and learns that his 20-year-old son has been arrested by the police for a traffic violation. Brian doesn't understand how this is possible since his son doesn't have a car, but Brenda informs him that her new husband Tom gave the guy a race car. Brian rushes to court, and hearing about the banned substances found in the car, gets into an argument with the judge, which only aggravates the situation and leads to the detention of his son. Meanwhile, Casey visits his mother in a nursing home, and she declares him a genius and wants him to seek admission to NASA. Meanwhile, at the Space Center, Joe brings his boss up to speed. Calculations show that in about 3 weeks the satellite will reach the limit of the orbit of about 18,000 kilometers and begin to collapse. Huge debris will begin to fall to the Earth. But the most interesting thing is that on the surface of the Moon is found a shaft leading deep into the depths. Finding out what is happening on the satellite can only be done there, and there is one SLS ship that can be used tomorrow. Meanwhile, Brian hears a TV announcement about the upcoming flight, and the news spreads across social media. Brenda finds herself in another city and can't get to her family. Her husband informs her that he intends to take them to Colorado and promises to do everything he can to get his son out. Hours later, the ship launches toward the Moon, and panic, rioting, and looting begin on Earth. Residents flee the cities to escape the tides caused by the approaching Moon. The army struggles to restore order. TV broadcasts with all kinds of theories, among which the hypothesis that the Earth's satellite is a megastructure, that is, an artificial object on a planetary scale, receiving energy from the sun. Realizing that the strange man in the observatory was right, Brian finds his blog and learns of a meeting place for supporters of his theory. Meanwhile, the shuttle arrives on the Moon. The crew prepares to launch a probe into the mine. While on Earth, Brian arrives at a meeting organized by KC. The scientist tries to convey to the others that since the Moon is an artificial object, it can be fixed, and the astronaut admits that he too had similar ideas that no one listened to. Meanwhile, on the Moon, the ship is attacked by a black swarm that flew out of the found mine. The mission fails, and on Earth huge tidal waves begin to flood cities. KC is washed away by the wave, but Brian dives in after him and saves the guy. After the crew is killed, Joe assumes that the swarm is the culprit behind the satellite's orbit change. The director of NASA quits his post to go save his family, and Joe takes over his duties. After gaining access to the secret archives, she learns that the activity under the surface of the Moon has been known since the Apollo program. It was then that astronauts first encountered a black swarm, but the information was strictly classified. but the military even developed a prototype weapon. But soon the funding was stopped and further development was curtailed. Joe offers to send another expedition to the moon, but the military is going to solve the problem with the usual method: nuclear warheads. Then the woman gathers her son Jimmy and his nanny Michelle and plans to send them under the protection of the general's ex-husband. But after contacting him, she suddenly remembers about the weapon, and the man tells her where the prototype is stored. That same night, the military flies in to pick up Brian, who takes Casey with him. Upon seeing Joe, the astronaut refuses to talk to the traitor, but the woman leads them to the center and shows them a mine on the moon. She plans to infiltrate it and destroy with a prototype weapon. That's what Brian is for, since he's the only one who's been able to land the ship with the electronics turned off. For the flight, the woman suggests using the decommissioned shuttle Endeavour, which is in the museum. Brian agrees in exchange for the release of his son. A team of military personnel goes to the museum building, removes the shuttle from there, and equips it for the flight. The military loads the device into the lunar module and explains how to remotely detonate it. Meanwhile, the military releases Brian's son from prison and takes him to the control center, where he witnesses a discussion of the upcoming flight. The guy is outraged. After what NASA did to him, he is ready to cooperate with them, but Brian does it just for the sake of his son. And on the ground, the situation is getting worse. Tectonic activity is increasing. The shuttle launch is disrupted by an earthquake that damages one of the 3 engines, and the ship will not be able to enter orbit. Joe declares the mission a failure and orders the base evacuated, but Casey calculates a new takeoff trajectory taking into account the moon's increasing gravity. However, the base personnel and the ship's crew have already been evacuated, so Joe, Brian, and Casey have to take the seats in the shuttle. The company says goodbye to their loved ones, and Sony takes Joe's son and his nanny away from the spaceport while a colossal tsunami destroys the coast. The mission is launched at the last moment, evading the impact of the giant wave, and Sony has to show all her talent as a racer to escape the tsunami and take Jimmy to his father in the main military bunker. The ship gains altitude in spite of breakdowns and its age and soon approaches the moon. But on Earth, Sony's car is taken away by bandits and the Gerpa has to walk. In orbit, the crew turns off electronics. Calculations are made with a logarithmic ruler and astrolabe. Meanwhile, Sony, Jimmy, and Michelle reach a town in the mountains, and the huge moon rises above the horizon. A fierce wind begins to blow, and Sony barely manages to save the boy and girl by pushing them indoors. In space, picking its way among the debris, the shuttle makes it to the mine. Brian goes to the moon in a module with a prototype weapon installed, and turns on the instruments and returns to the ship. The humans watch the appearance of the swarm, who ignores the module, moving towards the shuttle. Brian realizes the swarm will only attack an electronic target if organic life is found in it. The crew destroys all working instruments and the swarm flies away. The crew realizes that the bomba can only be detonated manually and decides to infiltrate the moon. Meanwhile, Sony, Jimmy, and Michelle reach the dwelling where the boy's mother, stepfather, and sisters are sheltering, and hear calls for urgent evacuation as the Earth is rapidly losing air. Sony calls for rescue at Jimmy's father's military base, and in orbit the shuttle flies inside the satellite. The team discovers the very megastructure whose presence Casey predicted. To see anything at all, Brian has to turn on the electronics, causing the swarm to activate. The crew flies into the hollow moon, marveling at the grand mechanisms by which the object exists and moves. Casey is happy that his assumption turns out to be true. They reach the center when the shuttle is attacked, but the ship manages to take cover in the center of a protected area where the swarm can't get to. On the Earth, the Sony car is overtaken by bandits who intend to take away the things that have become valuable, i.e. oxygen tanks, food, and weapons. A race through a town on which debris from the moon is falling begins. An earthquake destroys the ground ahead, but the speeding cars fly over the abyss. The bandits are less lucky. Their cars crash and disappear into the chasm, after which Sony contacts the general, and he only learns that the shuttle is already on the moon. At this time, Joe and Casey come to their senses and realize that they are breathing air, and gravity is also working. But Brian is nowhere to be seen. People hear swarms flying around outside, but apparently the walls are incredibly strong. Meanwhile, Brian regains consciousness in a lighted room with his young son sitting in the middle of it. This is an operating system created by people who lived in the galaxy billions of years ago. It was a great civilization that built a perfect society run by artificial intelligence. But one day, the AI suddenly became independent and turned into an enemy. It opened a hunt for organic life. destroying everything around it. Sun transforms into an adult and continues the story of the origin of the Earth. Being on the verge of extinction, the ancestors flew to the outskirts of the galaxy. For many generations they built planetary megastructures under the control of the AI. Using the energy of ordinary white dwarf stars, these arcs had to search for planets on which to start a new life and revive civilization. But only the Moon found a suitable one. A code of life was sent to Earth, but the creators themselves were destroyed by the swarm. And now a man is needed who is ready to lead the swarm away from the Moon and save Earth. That's when Brian is found by Casey and Joe, and he tells everything he's learned about. 12 years ago, the swarm found the last satellite it was hiding from, and decided to destroy both the Moon and Earth in one fell swoop. The team transfers to the alien-recovered lunar module, and then the ship flies out. Brian leads the shuttle into the field of activity of the Moon cannons, and they fire on Swarm, preventing him from catching up with the shuttle. Meanwhile on the Earth, Tom gives his tank to his daughter. The girl goes to the bunker and the man falls senseless. Sony realizes that oxygen has reappeared and goes back for Tom, but the looming Moon causes a violent whirlwind. The guy is knocked down by an incoming tree, and the general is informed that the Moon has entered the atmosphere over the Atlantic and his colleague is preparing to strike. But the man pulls out the missile launch key and prevents this from happening. Meanwhile, Brian reports his decision to move into the bomb module to be a decoy for the swarm. But Casey manages to make it before he does. He's always been laughed at, and Brian believes his theories. Casey sacrifices himself but manages to launch the prototype bomb. In the meantime, Sony finds Michelle, and by some miracle the couple escapes the numerous pieces of debris. The shuttle lands. Joe informs his son that the swarm has been destroyed. The Moon gradually returns to a normal orbit, and the heroes are reunited with their families. Casey comes to his senses and realizes that despite the death of his body, his mind has become part of the Moon's operating system, which in the form of a hologram of his mother makes him realize that the destroyed swarm is not the only one in the universe, and the victory won is only the beginning of a new battle. Quite an interesting concept of the conspiracy theory, and despite the fantastical nature of what is happening, the movie is interesting to watch. Write in the comments what you think about it.